Hey everyone, welcome back to iStart Insider, where we dive into the journeys of young innovators, creators, and changemakers. I'm Shruti.
And I'm Mahalakshmi, and today's guest is someone we're so excited to have on this podcast, Prisha Bhat. She's a Regeneron STS finalist, founder of Empower Earth, a science researcher, a public speaker, an artist, basically a powerhouse of passion and purpose.
She's explored so many fields, from genetically modifying rice to make it more resistant to drought and arsenic, to organizing art exhibits that educate communities on similar toxins. Prisha, welcome to the show. How's it going?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for being here. We're so glad to see you today. So, before we jump right in, what have you been working on lately?
Yeah, so recently it's kind of just been like the last few months of my senior year. And actually, my latest scientific research project is different from what I've been working on previously. Specifically, I'm working on this microbiology project. And I'm looking at this enzyme called FDH and how we can use it to remediate another type of toxin from the environment. And it's been really cool, really fun to work on. And I've also been organizing what I'm going to do when I go to college.
That's great. Maybe going into that project that you're doing currently, is there anything that's like more connected to other experiences you have to like why you chose to research the enzyme?
I've been interested in bioremediation and methods for getting rid of pollutants from the environment, whether that's water or soil, for several years now, actually. Like, I first started out being interested in remediating heavy metals from soil several years ago. When I was in seventh grade, I visited my grandparents in this really rural village in India. And actually, one of those summers when I went, my grandmother had actually consumed some rice and it was contaminated with arsenic. So, this unfortunately wasn't really an isolated incident because the contamination of crops, whether that's rice or other different plants of heavy metals, is incredibly common, not just in India, but around the world. And that really showed me how big of an issue that contamination was. I kind of began there with looking at ways to remediate the soil of heavy metals. So, that includes things like lead and arsenic. And just this past summer, I was looking at these contaminants called C1 or one carbon compounds. So that basically just means these chemicals like methanol, formaldehyde, and formate, which are kind of different from heavy metals, which I focused on in the past, but still, I would say a really pressing issue.
That is absolutely fascinating, Prisha. Could you tell us a little bit more about exactly how you're going about the research process, and have there been any drawbacks or any road bumps to what you've been doing so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So, research is something that's really fulfilling to me, but there are really challenging parts of it as well. I think probably one of the hardest things that I've had to face is getting access to a place where I could do the research in the first place. So, one of the challenges of like life sciences research as a whole is that you're kind of limited by what you can work with. Whereas with engineering projects or computer science projects, really anyone can do it. When I was in ninth grade coming into high school, I knew I really wanted to do research, but that was kind of right after COVID had ended. And COVID really put a challenge on any high school student wanting to work in a lab because many university labs were just not accepting students. And it was just really hard to get access to those resources. I remember around that time, I would cold email so many professors, ones that were local to my area, ones that weren't. And unfortunately, I didn't really get any responses. And I kind of knew that I really shouldn't take it personally. Any high schooler, for that matter, shouldn't either, because these professors are really busy. And although you can be a really valuable asset, sometimes their labs are just full. So instead, what I decided to do is I kind of switched gears and decided that I did need access to that technology in those facilities, but it didn't necessarily have to come from a university. So instead, I actually contacted a local outpatient clinic, and turns out they actually had this lab workstation. And although it wasn't quite as advanced or didn't have the technology that a university lab might have, it was still good enough for my purposes. So I was able to improvise. I did have to kind of make a lot of substitutions using perhaps less precise technology. But at the end of the day, I think that it was worth it. And for my purposes, I was able to pull it off.
I think that's a great experience. I think a lot of the time, especially being so young, ninth grade is very young. And like Also, just like COVID being, there's so many obstacles that kind of come in your way. But you just told us, like, I think you've handled it really nicely. And it kind of shows that science does not need to be limited to, like, oh, it's a professional laboratory or something.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it could be done even at our homes or a clinic. I think it's just amazing. I'm speechless by seeing how much you've done. And we kind of wanted to touch upon something else. Like your project focused on drought resistance and also toxicity. And you tackled both. And usually people just kind of tackle one or the other. Why was it important for you to combine both of those problems?
Mhm. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. That was something I had to ask myself at several points during my research because I would say that sometimes in science there's a discouragement against doing things that are too ambitious because sometimes if you try to tackle many issues at once, then it kind of just dilutes the effect that you have on any single one of those issues. But I would say that specifically drought and arsenic are two important problems that we need to look at combined because they actually affect each other in different ways. So, kind of one of the inspirations I had for this project was actually this research article written by this professor at Stanford. I think his name is Dr. Scott Fendorf, but he wrote this paper talking about how together rice contaminated with arsenic and rice that is stressed by drought can reduce the yields of that crop by about 40% combined. And that statistic just really stuck with me and I started doing some more research on how those two issues are connected. I found out that there are so many different ways that drought, which is kind of caused, I think, primarily by the increasing prevalence of climate change, will actually just magnify the effect of arsenic contamination as well. Like, for example, during periods of drought stress, farmers will usually reuse the water to flood the paddy fields, which is how they cultivate rice because rice is a very water intensive crop. And if that groundwater just so happens to be contaminated with arsenic, reusing that water really doesn't do you any favors when it comes to arsenic contamination. And there are a bunch of other mechanisms as well. Like, for example, when it's hot in drought periods, it can kill off the microbes that are present around the roots. And sometimes those microbes can actually help to protect plants from arsenic toxicity, but without them, it just makes it even worse. So these two issues are just so closely connected, which is why I decided I needed to tackle both.
That's a really great response, I think, to a huge problem that many people probably knew was an issue. But I think the fact that you took the initiative to see that it's a problem and try to do something about it, even though you were so young and you very well could have faced failure. That actually leads me into my next question. If you could tell your younger self one thing about the biggest failure you faced so far in life and how to learn from it and grow from it rather than being defeated by it or lingering on it, what would you tell yourself?
I would say that my general advice to my younger self would be to not be too intimidated by science overall. So I think one of the biggest things that I think limits younger people from going into science is that it just seems so intimidating. Like there's so much jargon, so many different techniques, and so many different fields within STEM as a whole. My younger self was definitely like incredibly overwhelmed, especially because I was able to just like see the breadth of work that, like, other people who weren't exactly my age, but, like, slightly older than me were able to do, and it just seemed, like, impossible almost, like, I didn't really understand, like, man, how do these kids, like, get access to these resources? Because some of the research that I saw, like, high schoolers were doing was incredibly complicated, and I guess that kind of scared me a little, like, when I was younger, I didn't think that I was capable of doing something up to that caliber, and so it's really a cycle because if you tell yourself like, "Oh man, like it's so complicated, there's no way I could do it," that limits you even more. And I think sometimes you just have to be like a little bit delusional in a way, like you just have to tell yourself like, "I can do it. This is entirely possible." And then you'll end up actually being able to do it because you're actually confident in yourself. So that's probably something that I would tell my younger self.
Yeah, great points there. And kind of changing the direction of the podcast, let's talk about Empower Earth, a nonprofit that you were doing while doing your research. What inspired that? And it looks like you also had your first project at your school. What was that experience like?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually kind of became interested in environmental justice as a whole because I think it really captures the intersection between two of my interests. So I've been kind of into like plant sciences, environmental sciences for quite a while, but something else that I really like doing is advocacy and public speaking. So I've been part of speech and debate since middle school, and right now I'm the captain of my school's speech and debate team. And it's communication is something that I think is an incredibly valuable part of our society. And I kind of through speech and debate, I was able to learn about various different social justice issues that I thought were incredibly important and wondered why more people weren't talking about them. I kind of became more aware of societal inequities through speech and debate. One summer, I had actually learned that climate change and issues relating to climate change didn't really affect every demographic group equally. So you would think that issues that are scientific in nature kind of don't really discriminate, but they actually do. And that kind of is, I guess, in a nutshell, what environmental racism or environmental injustice is. So, specifically, the project that I did for Empower Earth was relating to tree inequity. And that basically just refers to the uneven distribution of trees in different regions. So, for example, less privileged people or marginalized individuals, people of color, people of lower socioeconomic status typically tend to live in neighborhoods that have less trees. And that might seem pretty innocuous, but trees are actually really valuable. They can provide health benefits and also psychological benefits as well. And so, what happens is that this uneven distribution can cause a disparity in health issues, like, for example, with skin cancer and lung cancer being more prevalent in areas that lack trees. And so, what I did for my project is I actually organized a tree planting event at my high school because I noticed that our area specifically kind of lacked trees. And living in Texas, especially, that's kind of a problem because it gets insanely hot here. And so, what I did is I essentially just started this really long email chain with my assistant principal because it was a very long process getting them on board and really trying to advocate for myself and what I thought was important in my community. But ultimately, I was able to get permission from him to actually do this project. And so I got together some other friends and community members, and we were able to actually plant some trees on the campus. I ended up expanding this project to plant a bunch of other trees just around town as well. It did require quite a bit of research. You would think it's pretty simple just planting trees, but it actually takes a lot of work. You have to figure out which trees are native to the area. You have to look up on tree laws. You have to figure out just how deep of a hole you need to plant for certain tree varieties. But it was overall, I think, a really fulfilling process.
I did some tree planting myself, so I get where you're coming from.
Yeah.
There's a really big process to it. But I also wanted to highlight, so I get that tree equity is like a really big problem. And do you also, as Empower Earth, do you also want to tackle the discrepancies that happen? Like, you highlighted how a lot of communities are affected by like tree equity, like the issues of tree equity. So is that something that you also want to tackle with also, increasing tree equity?
Yeah, I think that I definitely like to expand on these projects as I go into college, maybe even start like a new chapter of the nonprofit at wherever I decide to go for my undergraduate studies. And I think there are also a bunch of other avenues for combating environmental injustice. For example, one problem that I can think of at the top of my head is natural disasters. Like, for example, I know Hurricane Katrina several years ago it did affect, like, a bunch of individuals. However, I would say that specifically for people who don't quite have as much money or people who live in certain areas of town, it takes them a lot more work to actually recover from those natural disasters as well. So perhaps by doing fundraising events for specific communities that are marginalized, that are really affected in a very specific way by these natural disasters, we can help combat environmental justice through that avenue as well.
I think that's an amazing approach. So you're taking one issue and you're tackling it from all directions, which is something you rarely see. So I just want to commend you on that because I think that's incredible. It must have taken a lot of discipline and hard work. Could you walk us through that? Like for a startup founder or entrepreneur or someone who's starting a nonprofit, what would you say to motivate them and get them through the process of building a more fully fledged business or nonprofit?
Yeah. I would say that for either of those things, it is so important for you to remember your purpose because it's really easy for you to kind of stray away from the main goal of your nonprofit or of your startup. And you kind of forget about what problem you were trying to solve in the first place. But I do think it's really important that you keep in mind why you're doing this in the first place as you're working through that entire process. And to also make sure that as more and more people are joining your team, if you decide to kind of expand your nonprofit or your business, that you make sure that they're also aware of the purpose of it in the first place. Because, especially as young people, I think that there tends to be kind of a stigma around any initiatives that we start because people just assume that we're doing it for our resume or for a college app. But that's not necessarily true. Like, who's to say that we aren't passionate about issues as well? Combating societal inequities or solving a problem or deciding to create our own business isn't something that should be exclusive to people who are older, more experienced, more wealthy, etc. I think that is something that should be kind of democratized, especially for younger people, because we also can bring very fresh perspectives to things that older people maybe can't.
Great point brought up there. I think there is definitely a huge stigma around this. I feel like anyone trying to do something different or also trying to tackle issues often face like questions of, oh, are you doing it for your college application or stuff like that? And I think you are one of those examples where we've seen your story how you've been affected by your grandmother and how you wanted to bring change and take that initiative. So yeah, thank you for that work. And I also think you're a great example to show that sometimes you can take action. And even though you may be questioned, like you can still continue with your work and, making sure that you have that your purpose is clear in your mind, you can definitely get through that. Kind of a fun detour. Your mom says that you like setting things on fire in the safest way possible. What's the story behind your welding hobby?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say that if someone were to just look at me, they wouldn't really expect me to do this. I started it mostly for fun because I was just bored one summer. Welding is, you would think that it's something that people do for very practical purposes. I know that, like, at my school, we have an auto tech class and they learn how to weld specifically to like fix cars and stuff like that. But I actually learned that there are a lot of different ways people do it just for fun and for also artistic purposes as well. And to be completely honest, I'm not super good at it. The projects that I've done weren't exactly like the most successful. You'd probably need me to like explain what it's supposed to be to actually like know what it is once I made this flower out of bolts, but it didn't look the best. But still though, it was fun for me to do. And I think it's also cathartic in a way because you don't have to always focus on your academics or like specific initiatives. Instead, you can wind down doing something just for the fun of it. And yeah, it is a bit dangerous. I did almost fry my hair off a bunch of times. I also do soldering as well in my digital electronics class. And I actually did burn a little bit of my hair off when I was doing that, but it was okay. It was just like this much. But I don't know, there's just something very satisfying about it, like, as you see, like, the smoke from, like, the soldering iron or the arc going into the air, it makes me feel kind of cool, like I'm some kind of, like, mad scientist or something.
You don't need to feel like one. You are
Yeah.
one. Just not the math part.
Yeah, I would hope not.
No, definitely not. But that's amazing. You have such a diverse array of hobbies and interests from science and like hardcore lab work to welding. And honestly, that sounds really fun. But yeah, I hopefully you don't burn any more hair off in the
I
future.
hope not, yeah.
Um, and like you mentioned, like not always focusing on academics or specific initiatives. And I think this is a question that and a struggle actually that a lot of high school students face, including myself.
Mhm.
How do you balance academics, extracurriculars, personal initiatives, and just like being a person?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's also something that I found myself struggling with too as I entered high school. And honestly, even sometimes now, I feel like, man, how do I even do all of this? But I would say that kind of like the first thing is the principle of diminishing returns. Amongst us high schoolers, we face a lot of pressure to work as hard as possible and like dedicate every waking hour to fulfilling whatever goal we have at that moment. But it's important to understand that at a certain point, the amount of work that you put into something won't necessarily give you like an increasing quality of your results. Like one example of this is studying for a test. Obviously, you should study for your tests, but at a certain point, you should know when to give yourself a break and also when to understand that I think I'm good for this test. Maybe I'll study a little bit more later, but for now, I think I'm okay. And the same goes for like working in the lab or something like that. There are a lot of times where the procedure you're running isn't working right. And sometimes you just have to step back and then wait a few hours, maybe watch a movie or something, and then come back with a fresh perspective. Because those few hours or any break that you'll take can actually give you an entirely new perspective and really help you understand maybe what you've been doing wrong, how you can improve. And when it comes to just having fun, it's really important, no matter whether you're like an introvert or an extrovert, to just find people who you genuinely enjoy hanging out with. Sometimes you should make friends with people who will motivate you to try harder, but I think you should also have those people who you can just goof off with, like people who kind of just have this sense of whimsy or people you can have these inside jokes with. So that way you're not always focused on grinding all the time and you can actually just relax.
Yeah, great point there. I think that's a very big issue among students today. I feel like we're just so encouraged to like always work 24 by 7. And I think that's a great point that you just brought up, making sure that you are taking care of yourself, having time for yourself. Um, I know we've already asked you this, but there are many students that are probably wanting to make a difference like you. And lastly, what's like the biggest piece of advice that you think students should have and something that they should keep in their mind?
I don't really want to get copyrighted by Nike, but to be honest, like my biggest piece of advice would literally be to just do it. This is something I struggle with as well. Like I'm telling myself, like, man, this thing is so hard. I don't even want to start because if I can't do it perfectly, then I just shouldn't try at all. But I just want to let everyone know that that mindset is absolutely not true at all. And sometimes, like when you just start, like you forget about any fears you might have of not doing super well or not winning the competition, if you just let go of that and just try, it actually becomes a lot less intimidating than you'd think. The same goes for anything really, like even in academics, sometimes you find yourself procrastinating, working on something, and it's actually a lot easier to just start and do it than to just like have that stress in the back of your mind, like, oh my gosh, I still need to do this. You'll find that it's actually really freeing to just do things without having that added anxiety of what the outcome may be or whether or not you'll do it as well as you would have hoped. You should just sometimes embrace things fully without that internal monologue stressing you out.
That is really good advice. And I think you're so holistic in the way that you approach life. So, like the same multifaceted approach that you apply to science, you also keep with your overall life, which I wonder is like that's why you're so successful. And that's why you've been able to do all these things at such a young age. Thank you so much for coming on today. It was amazing to speak with you and learn from you. And I think that piece of advice is so powerful. It's really simple, but my friend told me something similar. She said 50% of the work is starting. And I think that's so true because once you start, there's so many people who've told me just start and say you'll do it for 2 minutes and then you end up working for a lot longer. And I think that really works. So that was amazing advice, Prisha. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to y'all today. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you again. And I think that's a wrap. That's it for today's episode of iStart Insider. Just to recap, today we explored how a single moment in India sparked a journey across science, advocacy, and creativity. From engineering rice that can survive drought and remove toxins, to launching a nonprofit and using art to educate, Prisha has showed us that science isn't just about discovery, it's about making impact. Once again, thank you so much, Prisha, for coming on today and inspiring all of us.